Hi, my name's Moonpie, and today we're here to talk about the Treaty game mode in Age of Empires 3. Now, I've noticed that a lot of players since Definitive Edition has been released are trying to play Treaty but don't necessarily understand some of the core concepts. So today, I'm here to talk about a few of those concepts. We'll be taking a look at decks, hotkeys, economy, base layout, unit types, and military. Let's get started with the decks. Now, a lot of players understand the relevance of having a good military and good economy, but a number of newer players don't understand the importance of having a good deck, or simply don't have the understanding of how to put one together. Where if players have a bad deck, they will typically lose the game before the game has even started. So let's take a look at this potential beginner deck, where you have a number of unit cards and resource cards. Now in Treaty, you almost never want to include unit and resource cards apart from in specific situations with infinite cards. And why is that? Well, let's take a look at this 16 Musketeer card. At its default value, it's worth about 1600 resources, as Musketeers cost 75 food and 25 gold to create. In the short term, that's fantastic, 1600 free resources. But in the long term, which is typically how Treaty is played, you will get much more value for other cards. For example, if you included the Team Gunpowder card, which increases hit points by 15%, you will get much more value. And why is this? Well, in treaty games, you're typically making hundreds, if not thousands, of similar units, where when you apply a 15% buff to the HP, you will get much more resources back passively. For example, in a treaty game, I might make 500 musketeers. If you add the 15% hit points to them, that basically equates to 75 extra musketeers, which is worth 7,500 resources, which is obviously a significantly larger amount than 1,600 that you otherwise would get. So effectively, you could remove all of these unit cards and instead replace them with unit upgrades. Obviously, if you're including cards that increase hit points and damage, that amplifies that bonus. Where if you're killing your opponents faster than they're killing you, that means that your opposition is having to create more units as a result, which means they're spending more resources than you are, which means they'll run out of resources faster than you will, which is exactly what you're trying to do, out-sustain your opponent. Another example is resource gathering cards. The 1,000 food crate, in a similar case to the 16 musketeers, is great in the short term, but in the long term is far surpassed by resource gathering increases. For example, the refrigeration card increases food gather rates by 20%. Let's say you have 40 villagers gathering food from mills, which has a base gather rate of 0.67 food per second. Adding 20% on top of this gives you 0.804. Now, over 20 minutes, this equates to an extra 6,432 food. Now, I'm no maths genius, but I'd say 6,432 is significantly more valuable than 1,000. So when you're putting together a deck, it's definitely worth considering the long-term implications for the cards you're choosing, as you can win or lose a game based entirely on your deck. The next factor we'll be taking a look at are hotkeys. In the following sections, you'll see me making use of hotkeys, and it's really something you need to incorporate into your gameplay. Every building and every unit has a hotkey associated with it, and you should be using them. By relying on hotkeys, it means you're not relying as heavily on your mouse. This reduces the time Q in action, meaning you have more time to focus on other aspects like balancing your economy or controlling your units in a fight. I personally use a unique hotkey for each building and unit, as that was the default in Age of Empires 3. In Definitive Edition, however, players have the option of using row and column-based hotkeys, which is now the default. This means that regardless of whether you select a town center, a barracks, or a villager, each item in row 1, column 1 will always be the same hotkey. Using hotkeys might at first feel uncomfortable, but you'll quickly remember them, and is something I feel is essential for becoming a better player. Now that we've had a good look at the hotkeys, we'll now take a look at the importance of an economy. We're now going to be taking a look at the early economy in a treaty game. Now, dependent on the civilization and boom you pick, will really determine the sort of build order and timings you should be going for, so take what I do and what I say as a general rule only. And before we begin, if you're looking for a civilization to play, I'd recommend picking one of the European civilizations. This is because they all play fairly similarly and all have a fairly similar boom. So if you're new to the game, I would recommend starting with one of those civilizations. When you start, you obviously want to gather all your starting resources and queue up a villager as soon as you get 100 food. Additionally, those two villagers are doing. Additionally, you want to build a house and a market as soon as possible for a couple of reasons. Firstly, you want to make sure you don't get capped on population. So you're going to build a house. Additionally, you want to get the hunting dogs upgrade, which basically increases the gather rate of food from hunts, which are these guys. Now to get this upgrade, it'll cost 50 wood and 50 coin, which is why we're going to put these guys onto wood and coin now, to make sure we get that upgrade as soon as possible. And there's actually a little treasure here that gives us 30 coin, which makes it a bit easier to gather or get the resources that we need. And it's obviously extremely important to move your explorer around as early as possible to try and find treasures like that, as well as to scout resources that you need, or to scout resources that you need for later on in the game. So we have enough wood now, so now we can get hunting dogs, which increases growth by 10%. You notice I've done a couple unusual things there, where firstly the guys that are on the wood, I put them into the TC and then ejected them immediately. This basically allows you to teleport your villagers from A to B without them having to walk around the town center to get to the food. That basically allows you to save time and means that they're gathering for a longer period of time, which increases the food you get. Another thing I did there was I basically shot the herd and they moved towards my town center. That is referred to as herding, where you want to be doing anything you can to increase the efficiency of the way you're playing. Now we just got a home city shipment, so we'll select our card. Basically everything you're doing, you're trying to do it as efficiently as possible, and by having a hunt right on the town center. Oh, that's unfortunate. I missed that by a split second there. But basically, the way that hunting or that herding works is that animals will run in the opposite direction to where your villager is. So if I put my villager here and shoot them, they'll move. Now, an important consideration, so I want to try and get the one that's already dead, an important consideration is that this can only happen every 12 seconds. So if I do it again, they're not going to move. So you have to wait 12 seconds to be able to do that again. Now, what we're trying to do here is to get to 800 food before we can age. And an important consideration about food, so actually we're going to cancel this villager so we can age up straight away. So right now you're going to see me put 3 villagers on coin and 3 villagers on wood here. Now to get to the 3rd age, we actually need coin, which is why I've put the villagers on coin. And to increase the gather rate of coin, we can get placer mines, which obviously costs 75 food and 75 wood. Everything you're trying to do is just increase the efficiency of what you're playing at. So obviously we get that 10% increase. It obviously means we're going to be getting more resources sooner, which is what you want. But on that point previously about food, sometimes you have berry bushes that spawn around your town center, which places it right next to, which obviously means there's almost no travel time for your villagers. And my aunt's actually getting pretty far away here, so I have to herd them back in a second. We have 75, so we can get place mines. We can take them offward. We're going to herd these guys right now. But obviously, the issue with hunts is that they move, which means they can be pretty far away from a town center. Berry bushes don't move, they sit still, which is great. But the issue with berry bushes is that the gather rate on them is 0.67 food per second, where hunts are 0.8 food per second, which is obviously much greater. This is the exact same thing for mills as well, where we can build a mill now. We can't because we don't have enough wood, but you can basically build a mill in age 1, and it will allow you to gather an infinite amount of food. Now, that's fantastic. It doesn't run out of food ever. But the issue with mills, just like berries, is that the base gather rate is 0.67. The general rules for treaty are as follows. You want to be constantly producing villagers until you hit the villager cap, because obviously the sooner you get your villagers out, the more resources they can gather. Additionally, you want to hit the 5th age as soon as possible. As a general rule, hitting the 5th age around the sub 20 minute mark is generally preferable. And additionally, you want to be getting all of the gathering rate upgrades that you can. So you obviously have all the upgrades in the market in ages 1, 2, and 3. You have the 2 factories that you're able to get from your home city, and then obviously the upgrades that are available through the capital. Note that some of these rules are somewhat counterintuitive to achieving the others. For example, using food to age up instead of building villages. This is something that you'll need to balance, and the best way to understand this balance is to simply practice. With the basics of an economy covered, we'll now take a look at base layout. Now this base is horrific. I don't think I've seen a base this bad, but there have come times where I'm just looking at a teammate's base and just being like, it's going through your head. Why is this here? Why is that there? Just some things just don't make sense. So some people just don't understand where specific buildings should be. So generally speaking, you want your economic buildings at the back and your military buildings at the front. You also want to provide yourself with enough room to have an ample number of walls. Now, something that I see a lot of new players doing is doing one wall or no walls at all. And in Treaty, you need walls. Ideally, you'd have at least 4 or 5 layers of walls to just give you a bit of time if an attacker starts getting into your walls to repel the attack. So let's take a look at a base that makes a bit more sense. Okay, so here's the new and improved base. Now, both looks better and also flows a bit better as well. So for a couple of reasons. So firstly, you have your military buildings or your first line of military buildings on the outside of the wall. Now that seems somewhat counterintuitive, right? Because the wall is there to stop people from killing your buildings. But in the case of Treaty, what you typically do is amass an army and then you go to the half map point, and that's where you start fighting it out. Now what you do as soon as the fighting has started is you start putting buildings down with your villagers right behind or pretty close to where the start fight is. This basically allows you to have a bit more map control and pressure, because it basically means that you're producing villages, or so you're producing military units very close to the front line. So when they spawn, they're basically right there, rather than if you spawn them back here and they spend an extra 5-10 seconds getting there. The same can be said if your military buildings are in your base behind all your walls, and that then further adds another 5-10 seconds. So for specific maps, you'll want to have your military buildings in front of the walls, where you can basically reduce the time it takes for military units to get from point A to point B. Additionally, you'll notice that my eco is at the very back of my base. And one thing of note here is that all the plantations, the estates in this case, and the mills have 7 people on them rather than the maximum 10. And this is because there was a bug in, well, maybe not necessarily a bug, but there was an issue in Age of Empires 3 where if you had 10 villagers on, Because they're all walking around with 10 villagers on that typically bump into each other, which, I mean, you just saw it just then, they'd bump into each other, which basically meant they spent less time gathering
Qual é a sua
resources. Because
ordem?
when they're walking, they're not gathering food. They actually have to be
Sim.
standing still to be gathering food, and when they bump into each other,
Preparada?
it increases the time that they are
Qual é a sua
walking
ordem?
from the first gather point to the second gather point. So in the interest of gathering as many resources as possible, it makes more sense to put 7 villages on each mill and estate. Now, one other thing you may have noticed that is different between my base and the first base that I showed you was that the walls look fairly different, where in these walls there are no pillars. Now, why might that be? Now, if we go and have a look at this wall here that does have pillars, I'll explain why you delete them. Firstly, if there's an enemy mortar attempting to get through your wall, and they target this pillar, if they destroy this pillar, it will not only destroy the pillar, but it will destroy this wall and this wall. It's a pretty sizable hole. If there is no pillar here, they can't target the pillar. So they either have to choose this wall or this wall. Which when they destroy the wall, it's obviously not going to break the walls that are adjacent to it. That's reason one. Reason two is that when you delete the pillars before they've been built, the same thing for any building, you will get the resources back for it. Thirdly, if there's no pillars there, then the villagers don't have to build it, so you save on build time. And then finally, it just looks better. So how do you go about removing all the pillars? Well, I click on the pillar and then use Control, Shift, A, and then it'll select everything up until the 50 unit cap of that specific building or unit. Same thing works for villages. So if we
Qual é a
select the
sua
village and Control
ordem?
Shift A, it'll select up to 50 villages. We select our up to 50 pillars, and then we press delete. Now you'll notice that on the back wall, there are no gaps between the pillars. But on the front wall, there are some pretty glaringly big holes, which should be problematic, right? You'd assume enemies would just walk straight through, and you'd be correct. Why is this? Well, when you
Sim.
put the wall together, you have to do it in 2 segments like this. If you do it like this, and then delete all the walls, you'll see that the sometimes minor gaps depending on the length of the section of the wall, but it's not going to be massive holes that are going to allow people to walk through.
Preparado?
If, on the other hand, you do a massive wall like this, and delete the pillars, you can see there are some pretty big holes. So, for the slight discomfort of having to do 2 sections at a time rather than the entire wall, you get a number of benefits. So if you're not already doing this, I'd highly recommend it. But that pretty much sums it up for the base layout. We're now going to be taking a look at the military.
Vou escutar. Cursim.
The objective of treaty is to destroy your opponent's base whilst keeping yours alive, and this is obviously achieved through the utilization of military. Now, just before the 40-minute timer elapses, you should have your army ready to go. Now, in treaty, it's a general rule that you fight at the half map, so typically the half map point, and then try and push your opponent back to gain map control. Now, what is the best way to do this? Should you make a massive army of just infantry supported by cannons? Or should you use cavalry?
Sim. Sim,
Well,
sim.
ideally, you should be using both. This is because every single unit in Age of Empires has something that counters it. So your army should be composed of a number of units which can counter what your opponent could be using to try and counter
Vou
you.
escutar. Sim, vou
That
falar.
sounds a little
Vou
bit
escutar.
confusing, so let's
Sim.
break it down. So the first unit type we'll take a look at is typically the backbone of the majority of armies in Age of Empires 3 Definitive Edition, heavy infantry. Now heavy infantry, like the musketeer, typically has a higher health pool, a standard attack value, and the standard range of their attacks. This means that they can typically absorb a fair amount of damage before going down. Interestingly, if you look at their multipliers, In melee, musketeers have a bonus versus cavalry and light infantry, or in definitive edition, they're referred to as shock infantry. This means that if your opponent spams hussars at you, you can put your musketeers into melee mode and they will do a considerable amount of damage to them. But if your opponent sees that you have a lot of heavy infantry, they might start making a considerable amount of shock infantry to counter your heavy infantry. Now, why do shock infantry counter heavy infantry? Now, unlike heavy infantry, shock infantry will typically have a lower HP pool and lower base attack. However, they will have a much larger range on their attacks. But is that the only reason why you use them to counter heavy infantry? Well, if you look at their multipliers, they have a bonus versus heavy infantry as well as light cavalry, i.e., ranged cavalry. So when you take into consideration the bonuses they get when attacking heavy infantry, their attack is typically much higher than that of heavy infantry, which allows them to effectively trade with heavy infantry. So say you've made a whole lot of heavy infantry, and in response, your opponent has made a whole lot of shock infantry. What do you make in response to this? Well, you could make heavy cavalry, like hussars, which are melee cavalry. Now, why did they counter shock infantry? Well, if you take a look at the shock infantry multipliers, you will also see they have a negative multiplier when attacking cavalry. Because heavy cavalry on top of this typically have a higher hit point pool, this means that when they start attacking the skirmishers in melee, the skirmishers are going to get massacred. Now that your opponent is seeing their shock infantry getting massacred by your heavy cavalry, how do they respond? Well, as previously discussed, heavy infantry typically has a multiplier bonus in melee against cavalry, so they could make heavy infantry. Alternatively, they could make light cavalry, which is usually range cavalry, which, as I'm sure you've guessed, have a multiplier bonus against cavalry. Now, another extremely important aspect of a unit composition is artillery. Well, just like with other units, there are various types of artillery pieces. Firstly, you have artillery pieces such as organ guns, field guns, and horse artillery, which excel at killing infantry. You also have mortars, which typically can't attack units but can attack buildings. You then have culverins, which get multipliers when attacking artillery. So typically at the start of a fight, the majority of your artillery will be culverins. You would typically have between 4 and 6. You will then typically have a couple pieces of infantry killing artillery, so horse artillery typically. At the start of the fight, you will then use your culverins to try and kill the enemy culverins before then moving on to their other artillery. It's important to note that it takes 2 culverin shots to kill 1 culverin. So you'd typically like to have your culverins in groups of 2. So you can use 2 culverins at once to kill one of the opposition's culverins. Another fantastic way of killing artillery is with heavy cavalry, where heavy cavalry are quick and artillery is slow. So obviously, it's extremely important when you have your artillery out that you are protecting them from the threat of heavy cavalry. Now that was a brief overview of all the different unit types. We'll now take a look at a typical start army. Now before commencing looking at my unit compositions, I just want to point out a couple things. Firstly, in the bottom left corner, you can see that I have 279 out of 200 population. This is referred to as overpopping, and there are a couple ways to do this. Firstly, every European civilization has unique church tech cards, which are basically cards that are specifically available only to their civilization. For the Portuguese, for example, they have access to 2 unit cards. Firstly, a shipment of crossbowmen, and secondly, a shipment of light cavalry. All unit tech cards in the churches can be sent after you've overpopped, but will still count as population space. So, in the initial fight where you want to gain as much map control as possible, having a larger army than your opponent will allow you to beat your opponent's army and then gain further map control. On top of this, every town center allows you to send militiamen. Now, you might be thinking that these guys lose HP over time, so by the time that treaties actually started, they're only going to have 1 HP, so they're going to be useless. The thing that you use militiamen for is that you put them in a line at the front of your army. This allows them to absorb the first wave of fire from your opponent's army, as they're the closest thing to them. This basically means that your units that are more valuable are not getting shot in the first volley. Additionally, up the top left, you will see a number of control groups. Control groups are essential for increasing the efficiency in which you're able to play. Typically, I will put 4 barrackses on control group 1, 2 stables on control group 2, and 2 artillery foundries on control group 3. On control group 5, I will place my town center, and 6, 7, and 8 I will dedicate to culverins. So each culverin group has 2 culverins in it. And as previously mentioned, 2 culverins can one-shot 1 culverin. So you basically press 6, then target the enemy culverin, press 7, then target the enemy culverin, and then press 8 and target the enemy culverin. And it saves you having to try and madly select them in a blob of 150 different units. So now let's take a look at my lineup. As previously explained, you can see the militiamen at the front of my army. Now behind the militiamen, you can see me creating a line of musketeers.
Sim,
Now, as
sim.
previously established, musketeers, being heavy infantry, will typically have more HP than their counterparts. So as a result of this, I'm putting the crossbows and the toopy behind the musketeers so they can live a bit longer. You'll also notice that I'm changing the stance of these units. This basically creates additional spacing between the units so they're less susceptible to cannon fire. I then position my light cavalry on the left and right flanks to help reduce the potential threat of heavy cavalry. I then place my artillery at the back of my army and then place a blob of hussars on the right flank, ready to push into the enemy's artillery after the 40 minutes has elapsed. Now, as I'm sure you've noticed, my army has a combination of all units. It is a combination of heavy infantry, shock infantry, heavy cavalry, light cavalry, anti-infantry artillery, and anti-artillery artillery. The only thing that is missing is mortars, but those can be worked in fairly easily. Now, the main reason you want to have such a combination of units in your army is because of counters. You want to be able to counter what your opponent has, and you want to be able to counter what your opponent has that can counter you. In this particular case, you have a pretty solid foundation to be able to deal with whatever your opponent throws at you. Now that the treaty is almost over, you position your villages behind your army in preparation to build military buildings. The reason you want these down as quickly as possible is because right now, my military buildings are in my base, which means if I spawn units from them, they're going to take 20 to 30 seconds to get from the military building to the front line. As previously discussed, you want your military buildings as close to the front line as possible to reduce the travel time for your military units. Now you notice here that I also create some trade posts with my explorer, where these particular trade posts provide me with a number of benefits as well as additional units that I can create that don't count towards population space. This allows you to overwhelm your opponents with the number of units that you have. You also notice that I create walls. This is essential for maintaining map control. Now unfortunately, Blue did not create an army in front of me to fight, but you get the general idea of a setup. Now that basically concludes it for today's video. Now we've covered a whole lot of content, but I hope you've been able to learn a thing or two and improve your ability to play Treaty. I honestly feel the best way to learn and get better is through practicing. So take what you've learned today and go and play some Treaty. If you have any further questions, feel free to chuck them in the comments below, or swing by my Twitch, which you can find a link to in the description, and feel free to ask me. I hope you have a fantastic day. Bye.